Okay, welcome everybody. If I haven't met you before in person, my name's Ryan Adams. I'm the Volleyball BC Coach Development Manager. So the guy who will send out emails, or if you have questions about your coaching pathway or development or certification, that's me. This is the face to the email. Welcome to our first webinar of the year. I know it's still 2023, but I'm kind of counting this in our this year's club season. And just flew home actually to Ontario today to see my family for Christmas. So a little bit later time zone for me, but unofficially, this is also called beverages and bumps or bumps and bevies. So if you have a bevy, feel free to, sit back. I have a Christmas special eggnog and some rum. So we like to be casual and have a good conversation here. And we do have 99 people signed up, which is the most that we can have in this webinar. So we'll see if everybody shows up. But super excited to get going for this new year. I'm going to introduce Mischa Harris. Mischa is a co-founder of Athlete Wellness Academy and a good friend, a good work colleague. Had the opportunity and the privilege to work with Mischa for a long time, starting back with our youth national team programs back maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago now. And Mischa's been, or an Athlete Wellness Academy, been involved, an integral part of our Team BC programs too over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years. So got to work with Mischa pretty close hands-on with my team. I was the Canada Games coach last cycle for the women's program. So work with Mischa specifically with a team for the last few years as well. So that's been really great. Anyways, Mischa and Nick is the other co-founder, not here, but yeah, really passionate about helping coaches the same way I am, but they obviously have a very specific skill set and set of skills. So the last few years, and maybe Mischa will talk about this, but they've been diving a bit more into Armswing, trying to help people, and coaches and athletes be a little bit more efficient, a little bit more effective, and obviously have a longer healthy term with the Armswing. So it was a no-brainer for me to kind of ask them to come on and share a bit about that with coaches across the province. So welcome. And Mischa will talk a little bit about their newly launched Armswing Academy as well, that you guys will have some access to at a discounted rate, and he'll talk about at the end. But if you have questions, we will kind of stop. But if you have questions, you can post them in the chat if you don't feel comfortable asking them, and I'll ask on your behalf. Mischa has some built-in time for questions as well. And then at the end, if you have like a very specific question that you feel is like just situated for you, then you can hang around and ask that to Mischa, and him and I will be hanging out here afterwards. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it over to Mischa. Mischa, thanks for joining us tonight and sharing some of all the knowledge you've learned over the years.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. Super excited for this partnership to be able to be here with so many of our Volleyball BC coaches and potentially other Volleyball BC members. I want to get to know you guys in a little bit. But like Ryan said, I'm super passionate about helping coaches develop on this front. Obviously, tonight, the big focus is going to be on Armswing and how to coach it. I like to talk about the art and the science of it because it starts as science, but then actually getting the changes is kind of the art we've been working on for 10, 15 years of seeing what works, what doesn't, why that might be the case for some people, and really kind of getting through some of the frustrations that we've seen over the years. Obviously, as an athlete wellness academy, you probably guessed our first perspective is keeping volleyball players really healthy. And around attacking, for us, that looks usually like dealing with a lot of shoulder pain and a lot of back pain and sometimes ab strains, these common things that we see coming back again and again and again. And that's really how we ended up getting into working a lot on the Armswing. So you'll see a mix tonight of what we've been experimenting with for the last 10 years and come to kind of a system that's been working pretty well for us on creating what we call injury-free velocity, types of mechanics that we can hit harder so we can get a huge increase pretty quickly in the athlete's career and their progress. And we can do it without putting more load into the shoulder, into the low back. And often we can do that at the same time as we're actually like managing or rehabbing an injury. We'll talk more about that, but there's a cool place that they intersect. And that's one of the reasons why we love doing this education, is because it's so impactful and so beneficial when you know a couple key things about it and can impact athletes from a young age. So as I get my screen share going and the whole PowerPoint and videos and stuff, I would love to hear from you guys. If you want to take just a second to post in the chat, let me know if you are a coach, or if you're not a coach, what you are, a parent, an athlete, a director. I don't know what else you would be. You can put that in there if there's something I missed. And then if you're a coach, what age group and gender you're coaching. And I'll try and make what we talk about today as applicable to the kind of broad majority that I see in there. And then if there are any kind of burning questions that you're like, I hope he covers this, this is the thing I want to learn from tonight, please put that up there as well. And I'll make sure that I try and address some of those. So about a minute or two to put some stuff up there, and then I will get this going. Okay, let's see this chat. We've got 16 new girls, 15 new girls. Girls, boys.
Pretty wide range. Probably mostly looks like on like 16 and under, looks like mostly.
Cool. Yeah, seeing that too. Mostly coaches, couple athletes. Hey, Brian, couple names I recognize here. That's super fun.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that is super useful for me. Awesome. So we talk about this whole approach we have to the Armswing as an evolution. It kind of goes in line with a lot of the things we're seeing as kind of the next levels of sports science in our sport, and really in all sports across the board. There's some really cool developments happening lately as we understand more about the human body, more about biomechanics, more about anatomy and physiology, and then also more about the art of coaching and motor learning and behavior change and all of these things. So we'll try and touch on how all of those intersect and create this tonight. A little bit about me and my background before we get into the exciting stuff. I grew up as a player. I went through the Team BC pathway playing beach. Played with the beach national team for a year when I was young, and then at UBC, and I was really injured the whole time. I spent pretty much more time in physio than I did on the court. And so that gave me this kind of interest in what's going on with my body and how am I going to make this feel better? When I finished playing at UBC, I was studying kinesiology at the time and started working with the women's volleyball team as their athletic trainer I spent about 5-6 years with them. And that was kind of the initial testing ground of, I was starting to figure out things that worked for my body that got me healthy, and started rehabbing my shoulders, my knees, my back, my hips, my ankles. And it was stuff that I had never seen before and had never come across in my playing career. And it was really impactful for me. And so naturally, I wanted to start helping other players with that. So I started personal training volleyball players and applying this with the UBC women, and found that it was pretty effective. That when we took basically a movement-focused approach, which is kind of this in-between world between the rehabilitation side of things, where we're focused on like, oh, there's a shoulder injury. What's going on with the shoulder? Do we have a rotator cuff tear? Do we have a bicep tendon, tendinopathy or impingement? Or there's a low back injury. Okay, you got facet syndrome or something like this. And it's really focused in what those areas are. And got to more of the source of where is this coming from. And back in the day, that was 2004. That was pretty novel in the physiotherapy or in the rehab medicine side of things. A lot of it was really focused on that injury site. And we still see that a lot of today. The reality is that any sort of therapists who work with athletes have a really tough job, because most of the time when they're seeing athletes, they're just trying to put out fires. Athletes are coming in acutely in pain, acutely flamed up with stuff, and they have a huge amount of athletes to see and a very short window to work with them. So they would all love to do these big comprehensive assessments that we get to do, and to look at their biomechanics and to look at their video and do movement screens on them, and then tie it all together and figure out how to make changes. But it's not really within their scope, or within their logistical scope of what they have time to do a lot of the time. Similarly, it kind of follows this movement approach. It falls really close to strength and conditioning. Strength and conditioning, the mandate is bigger, faster, stronger. That's the stuff that they get paid for, to make athletes jump higher, to put numbers on everything that we can measure. They should be bench pressing more, they should be squatting more, all of these things. So when they also would love to see their athletes moving better and addressing all these injuries, they also are stuck with having a ton of athletes to care for, not being able to really personalize a lot of the programs, not being able to do a lot of these in-depth movement assessments and see where things are coming from. And then also that really neither of those professions have much of an input usually on what's going on court. So we see this kind of breakdown from what's happening away from the court, and then they get on court. Maybe their warm-up is kind of integrated, but then the technical side of things is left a bit up to the coaches. And coaches, as you all know, have a huge amount on their plate as well, to be able to manage not only just the whole team dynamic and the tactical and the technical and all the logistics of the team and all these things, and to then put on them, you need to be experts in biomechanics and injury prevention and manage all this on court. Really tough. So we found there was this big gap. And that's kind of where I have existed in my time with UBC. I did my master's basically on this approach to movement, looking at movement from a more holistic perspective and how that bridges the gap between rehabilitation and strength and conditioning and technical skill, and bringing those all together. I'm a kinesiologist. Work a lot with human movement. So I'm not working with volleyball players. I'm dealing with people with complex injuries, and bringing in more of like a holistic perspective to see what we can do to make some changes in those. Nick, who is not here tonight because his wife is very, very pregnant. He was one of my first guinea pigs who really bought into everything that we did from this more holistic perspective of developing an athlete from a young age. And so I had him do lots of weird things over the years while he was playing beach national team and indoor national team, and was player of the year at Trinity Western, playing 5 years there. And he then went on to play pro, and he had a cool career. He went through mostly uninjured. Little things would come up from time to time, but he was able to manage them. And when he talks about this, he attributes lots of his success to what he calls his availability. And this is a term that came from Ben Josephson, his coach at Trinity Western. Because he moved so well and because he was healthy so often and recovered so well, he was able to do pretty much whatever Ben asked of him. He wanted him to approach a certain way and hit a certain angle. Yeah, he can do that. He can do it cross, he can do it line, he can do it short, he can do it deep. And he can also do that with his serve. You want to serve from this angle to there, you want him to serve super hard and deep, or you want him to serve short and with a roll. And he could do all of those because his movement was so fluid and he just wasn't held back by anything there. And so that's really what we endeavor to get players coming towards, is this place where their movement is at such a place where it not only keeps them healthy, but it's a really good foundation for them to just be able to innovate and do cooler things on court with their skills. So tonight we'll talk about our 3 keys These are the things that we've distilled down as being kind of the non-negotiables, or the most commonly applied things that we see of athletes around the world who are the top healthy attackers. And then we'll look at lots of video on that. So you see lots of different examples on the men's side, on the women's side, different ages. And then we'll look at how to create changes. And this is, to us, the really interesting part that we're constantly refining and constantly trying to get better at, because it's not quite as simple as just knowing what you want it to look like and then telling the athlete to do it, as you guys are probably all aware if you're here trying to learn more about it. We'll have lots of time for question and answer throughout it. So please type anything in the chat if it comes up for you. We'll hopefully challenge some things that you've learned before, or that you've maybe been taught, or that you've been teaching. Certainly, I was teaching a lot of bad things before I learned a bit more about this stuff, and found better ways. And then at the end, like Ryan was talking about, we will talk about some next steps, our coaches at Armswing Academy, as well as just a couple ways to keep the learning going if this stuff interests you. So we talked a little bit about why the arm swing, that we started with the wellness side of things. Really, we were seeing a ton of athletes with shoulder pain, and we could clean up their movement a bunch, and we could get them really strong and really healthy. And then they would go back, and after still a big match or something, the pain would start to come back. And so we realized there was obviously more than just what we were doing, or more than just the movement side that we could help them with, that was becoming a challenge for them. And so we started to study more about this biomechanical side of things, of what's happening. If they're moving really, really well off the court, then they're breaking themselves down somewhere. And the only place that could be is through the technique of what they're doing. So we started to look at the mechanics of the athletes who were coming back with injuries, and the ones who weren't. The ones who came in and had some shoulder pain or some back pain, and they weren't moving that well. We got them moving better, and then they never came back. And the difference was really, really clear. And it came down to efficient biomechanics. The ones who were really, really healthy, the ones who stayed healthy afterwards, were the ones who used their body more like every other sport uses the body to try and produce any sort of speed through the hand, through the arm, to try and hit something hard, to throw something hard, to throw something far. So all the track and field sports, baseball, football, badminton, there's this common pattern that we see the body go through. And it all relies on this mechanic of producing a lot of rotation through the body. And that is probably a no-brainer for all the coaches here. You know that that's something we're trying to develop through attacking. But if we look at the video here, we see some cool stuff that Kira Van Rijk is showing. We'll look more at video of hers later, because it's pretty fantastic. This is one of the reasons why she's such an amazing attacker worldwide and server, is because her mechanics are so pure. So this image right in the middle here, if you guys can see my mouse, is this hip shoulder separation. And she's quite mobile. We worked with Kira since she was in high school, and this is kind of one of her superpowers, is she moves so well that, like Nick, she can just do anything with her body. So this degree of separation, with her hips facing basically forward and her shoulders facing mostly completely to the side, this 90-degree of hip and shoulder separation, is the same pattern we see in baseball pitchers, the same pattern we see in football quarterbacks, the same pattern we see in javelin throwers. This is where we access the biggest amount of rotational power in the body. Something is obviously different from volleyball players, and that's that we're in the air. So we can't use the ground. We can't do the same thing with our feet that that baseball pitchers would do. So it's going to look a little bit different. But this kind of moment in the air shows us that we've used the approach well, and we've used some other things that the arms are doing well to set up this, this strongest driver of rotation using all of these core muscles. So this we want obviously to be the driver of the arm swing. And if it's not, you guys can probably imagine what the arm swing looks like differently. And these are really clear things, or really things that we want to have super clear in our mind when we're looking at an athlete's arm swing or trying to help them with this arm swing is, are they using rotation through their body? Because if they're not, they'll be getting power or trying to get power from somewhere else. Option one, they're just not really getting any power. Option two, they're trying to get power and trying to do everything just from the shoulder. We don't see the shoulders open up. We don't see that twist of the torso turning away from the net. Everything stays square to the net, and it becomes a very shoulder dominant movement. Middles notoriously get caught into this because even sometimes they're coached to have a high arm and come in facing so they can be really, really fast. But what we find is that anything that we do that becomes really shoulder dominant in volleyball has a really, really low ceiling in terms of performance, in terms of the velocity side of things, but also in terms of longevity. To put it, to kind of relate it to other sports, this would be like trying to be a baseball pitcher and keeping your shoulders square to the plate and just throwing with the arm. It really would never, ever happen. You wouldn't be successful in any way, shape, or form, and you would blow up the shoulder completely. Because now, instead of using all these big muscles through the whole body like Kira's doing in this example, now we're just using the shoulder, and they're tiny little muscles that are not built for that prime movement. So this was the first thing we saw is if athletes didn't have a lot of rotation, their shoulders were destroyed. And it was really difficult to get them healthy because no matter how strong we got them, they were always asking more out of their shoulders. This was the interesting paradox with some of the best athletes, is that the stronger we got them, the more they blew themselves up because we didn't change the mechanic. We just gave them a larger engine, but they still had a car without any suspension. And they were just going faster and blowing themselves to pieces more. So that was kind of the first thing that we were looking at, is how do we get this rotation a bigger, more dominant piece of people's arm swing. The second piece that we saw as we started to analyze things, and actually I'll jump forward here and we'll start looking at some video on this, is that when I'm going to jump to the third key here, when we draw the arm back to initiate the arm swing, this really sets up a lot of what we're doing with the spine and then also with the arm throughout the swing. And players who had this higher draw, the opposite of Matt Anderson, who you see on the screen here, but athletes who bring the elbow high and the hand high, that would initiate the really shoulder dominant arm swing, almost more like playing darts. Is really the only sport that we found that does anything like this. Even water polo, where they're like underwater for the most part, they have like a little toss that goes like this, but then if they actually want to throw hard, they get up and out of the water and rotate with their whole body. So darts is about the best analogy we have. Any athlete who draws back high ends up pretty much hitting with the shoulder. But there's one other thing that they were doing. So number one is they don't produce any velocity if they have that pattern. Number two is they blow their shoulder apart. But every once in a while, they're kind of strong enough, they're resilient enough that they can start going a bit further and trying to get more out of this pattern of pulling the arm back high. And then they start really extending their spine. They come into a ton of back extension while that arm is up high. And that's where we started seeing a lot of the low back problems from. They're just constantly overextending and collapsing into the low back. And that was creating a ton of pain there. And that was pain that wouldn't go away no matter how strong their core was, because they were always giving up the core to get more velocity. And this is the super interesting thing that the body does, and especially the body of super high performance athletes, is it will always find a way to give you what you want. It will always sacrifice its health to get the job done. So we say we got to get more velocity on this, but we're not trying to rotate it all. We'll say, great, I can use a little bit more movement by just extending the back a little bit more, even though you're going to need a heat pack after playing and you're going to need some Advil tomorrow. We'll like do this for the short-term gain. So this led us to see this big difference of athletes all over the world and at all different levels, of the ones with this really high drawback and the ones with this really low drawback. And the more we studied this and looked at their patterns, we came up with what's our best working description of this, or our working rationale for this. Not inherently that drawing back the arm is something magical and special for the arm swing, but if you guys want to follow along and try this, is what we get all of our athletes to feel when they're working on this. If we put the arms high in that kind of high drawback position and try and rotate from side to side and see how much rotation does the spine have and how the shoulders feel. And then we put our arms more into where Matt Anderson has them here, where Kira had them, this low drawback position, which we usually say is like around shoulder height, is maybe the average of what we see. Some people higher, some people lower, but from there, and then you try and rotate, and we see how far you can move around there, and then how that feels in the body. And this is kind of the big insight into it, that for athletes who are good movers and try to produce the most amount of velocity and know how to do it right, they start realizing, if I want to hit this ball as hard as possible, I have to rotate as much as possible. And if I need to rotate as much as possible, then I've got to get my arms down here when I draw back. Because if I draw back up here, I get limited halfway through my rotation and I can't get nearly enough speed on the ball. And so this tends to, we call this like the gateway habit, this rotation piece, because it can lead us into having a lower drawback, and it can lead us into having this arm that is also looser, which is kind of our second key here, and out of the back extension and out of the shoulder dominance. So the looseness key, which we'll look at in video in a second, is all about turning the arm from less of a club into more of a whip. And this, I'm sure everyone is kind of aware of and has been wanting to work on, or trying to work on, or maybe doing a really good job of with their athletes. But it is one of the slowest learned things that we've found. It's been like a pretty big challenge for some of our athletes to learn that. It takes a little bit of time, and we'll show you what it looks like in a video here. I'm just trying to figure out the share. Let's go full desktop. All right. Big. We're going to look at Hank from Trinity Western. Hank's a very good mover, and so he's got access to all these ranges of mobility, and we'll see what looseness looks like at a pretty high level of application. So the first thing we see in this phase, I'll play it for you one time full, and then we'll back it up. So the first thing we see in this looseness side of things is that the athletes start taxing the elasticity of their body in every position possible. And so this looseness side of things really ties into this whip-like characteristic, that as we let go of a lot of the rigidity, then we start accessing this bounciness in the body. And so everyone probably knows that the only way to get into this position when you're in this double arm pull of your approach is like the bounciness that happens in your arms there. You're not just statically holding the arms up in that position. But with that bounciness, you swing them up, they'll bounce back, and they bounce back with more velocity. We start to see this in another few positions. We already saw that when we were doing the rotation, the arms at shoulder height and the arms overhead. That little bit of bounciness that your spine gives you at the side is the plyometric reflex, the same thing that we work on when we're doing jump training and trying to get that bounciness. And it's the reason why an approach gets you a lot higher than just a standing jump, where you don't have any ability to preload and to bounce beforehand. So the best athletes utilize as much of this elasticity as possible. And the only way to utilize all that elasticity is through the looseness, totally letting go and letting the body bounce back out of each one of these positions. So as Hank comes through this part of the arm swing here, this next phase of looseness is what happens in the hitting arm. So you see here his hand and the position that it's in. We see the fingers characteristically almost limp. And this is kind of the secret that we see some of the top attackers in the world do. We'll see it in Matt Anderson. We'll see it in Kira. We'll see it in Yuji Nishida. The more that we let go of the tension in the fingers, the more that this whole arm becomes just a cooked spaghetti noodle and becomes that true whip. And that's what we're trying to develop. And if we rotate well, then the brain starts letting you let go of all the tension in the arm. It doesn't need to be this club, this float serve style arm, and it gets to get more into that whipping zone. So we'll see some variation usually of this hand position. Sometimes the fingers drop down a little bit more, but really the tension let out of the hands. The other place we'll see looseness come in is just looseness through the legs, and that brings them into a lot of this counterbalancing of a lot of the knee bending that just counterbalances the amount of rotation. And Hank gets an incredible amount of rotation here. This is that full 90 degrees of separation that we see in the top players in the world. Then this really interesting aspect of looseness, and maybe the most impactful one, and one of the most determining of health in players that we've seen, is this external rotation that the shoulder gets into here. So this position, if you guys want to try it and feel it for yourself, of bringing your elbow up to about shoulder height, kind of happens earlier, it's about here, and then seeing how far your hand will get behind your shoulder. This is shoulder external rotation. It's a big deal in the baseball world and the pitching world. It has a huge correlation to pitch velocity and to athlete health. And when we lose that, especially in volleyball players, or when it's painful to get into that, it means that not only do we not get that elasticity in this component, which is the transition between the draw back and the arm swing to everything coming forward, but we also, if it's painful, we'll just not go into that position. We'll start to draw back, and then the arm will just stay kind of at this 90 degrees straight up and down, and then it will come forward like a club. So we lose our velocity that way. We don't have our elasticity, and then it just overloads the shoulder more and more. What's super interesting is that we've tested this movement with probably 10,000 athletes this year, of all the clubs and universities that we've worked with across North America. And about 80% of volleyball players down as low as like U13 have pain putting their shoulder into this external rotation position when we start training. And so for us, that's this huge red flag that's so easy to address. We do 5 minutes of warm-up stuff and some different patterns that are meant to get the shoulder open and out of their studying and their texting position, and out of maybe the shoulder dominant swing they've been using. And the shoulder gets healthy there again. And like, wow, this feels amazing. And then we create the opportunity that we can actually do something with that, and we can train more. So the shoulder external rotation is a big deal for the looseness side of things. And then this last thing that happens with the looseness is not stopping the arm and the body in part of the follow through. And so we'll see lots of players who attack and it looks almost more like a float serve. They kind of stop the arm here, they stop it partway down and are really looking where it goes. And again, this is like a baseball pitcher. We want to be developing so much velocity with the arm that our arm and our whole body carries us forward, like a baseball pitcher has to take that step forward and ends up twisted all the way around. That's a big deal for accelerating the arm enough. If your brain doesn't think that you have room to slow down, like if your set's too tight to the net or you're planning to slow your arm swing down because that's your pattern, it won't accelerate quite as much. It's a super interesting thing that the brain does. Similarly, if you can't land from a really high jump with control, your body will stop jumping higher. So we need to get these deceleration components really dialed in.
Hey, Mischa, yeah, I don't know if you're going to address this later, but there was a question from Ryan about those exercises or that you would do to help prepare and increase the range of motion.
Totally. Yeah, we're going to get into what we call the recipe later of how we make these changes. So for sure, we'll dive into those then.
Cool. And just a coincidence, actually, I save always, a bunch of different types of Instagram things for the athletes I work with privately, and I've saved actually 2 of Hank's videos for this particular reason, just a pure coincidence. So I'm going to share those because they're from Trinity's, like they have pretty high def cameras. So I'll share the Instagram links in the chat so people have like another, and it's a different angle too from the side and from behind. So just another a view of Hank's crazy loose arm.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ray. Cool. We'll look at a couple more examples of this now that I've overloaded your brains with so much technical talk about the arm swing. We get to see a little bit of it in action. So here's Kira Van Rijk doing a cool version of this as a right-hander on the right side. One of the harder ways to do this because we have to get the chest facing completely away from the court. So she goes through this pattern. We see similar kinds of looseness. There's that nice low hand. There's that limp hand facing down. There's the low draw, and her hand drops even lower than Hank's here. And what we see is there's a lot of individual variability and athletic variability. And even within one player, they'll have a lot of different patterns. But usually in this key or this main high velocity swing. So here Kira's going for it, and Hank's, it's a spin serve in practice last time, so he's just going for it. Things start to look a little bit differently if we start adding in the tactical components, and now we're trying to hit a different shot, or you're trying to fool the blockers or fool the defenders, or you're trying to hide a serve that you're doing. But all that's like the icing on top of the cake. We want to have the kind of warm-up swing dialed in and to be super, super efficient. So Kira also maximizes this rotation. She's got this shoulders facing us while hips face towards the net and the arms really low there. That's a nice knee bend. And then as she comes through, can't see it at all in this blurriness, but she hits that same kind of shoulder external rotation. And then we'll see it just from a different view here. Again, big arms overhead, really, really loose there. Those fingers turn down, full open. So we talk often about how we try and get young athletes to understand this, is that a good attack is basically a baseball pitch in the air. We often get them to show us what they would do for a volleyball swing and then what they would do for a baseball pitch or what they think that looks like. And a lot of them just genuinely think that they're very different things until we start showing them some of this video. And then we see what it looks like at the high end. We'll quickly take a look at Jackson Howe here. Cool example of what this can look like in the middle. There's all the looseness. He is ultra low with his drawback. So like we said, there's kind of this, there's this mean, which is maybe around the shoulder height. And there's some athletes who will be a little lower and some athletes who will be a little higher. As long as they're rotating well and they're hitting the ball as hard as they want to, and they're healthy, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But the rotation is kind of the non-negotiable, because otherwise it's all shoulder and it's a lot of spinal extension, and neither of those things are efficient or reproducible at all. Jackson gets into, again, the same cool position of being completely opened up here. And then we start to see a cool few examples here because these are just warm-up balls that they're going for. So his looseness means that his whole body ends up rotating around, and he lands with his right foot forward after taking off with his left foot way forward and really angled and open. So when we start working on the approach with athletes to get them using their approach to generate more rotation, this is kind of an easy entry point that we get them to exaggerate that rotation, landing with their feet the opposite way, which won't always be the case in games, but in a ball where they're hitting cross body or in a ball where they're trying to hit their hardest serve or something like that, we'll see that happen. Brody Hofer on the left side here, we see a really good degree of rotation on this last block step, his toe pointing pretty much straight at his setter. And again, coming into this full separation, nice loose arm, and landing with rotation because he's just letting it go like a baseball pitcher. Gabby on the women's side, super dominant attacker. When we look at female attackers, one of the big things that we're looking for that separates them in the world is the ones who can blow up defenders, who can hit right at them and hit hard enough that they can still get kills, even though they're hitting within the realm of a defender. And there are more and more of those athletes, but that's a huge differentiator in the women's game. And Gabby's been doing that for a long time. And we see some of why, because it looks exactly like the high end that we're seeing on the men's side. So this answers kind of a big question that we get a lot of the time, which is like, should it be different for men and women? Is it different somehow? And really the answer is that we see at the high end, no, it's not. It can sometimes be a little bit harder for a certain gender to get into some of these positions or to use them. It's a little bit harder for the women to develop this power. So we focus on that and some of the overhead stability. And it's a little bit harder for a lot of the guys to develop the mobility side of things. So we focus maybe a bit more on that. But it really comes down athlete to athlete. And that's where we see the fastest changes. Here's this example of she hits right at the defender and it's coming off too fast for them to handle. Last one we'll show here, and then we'll do some Q&A. Matt Anderson is pretty much the poster boy for what we call the fluid, smooth arm swing. On his serve, pretty much always looks and lands the exact same way, and it never looks like he's trying very hard. So we see this exact same position we've been talking about and seeing in everyone. As his hips start to go forward, we see the hands start to go backwards. And this is creating more and more of that elastic stretch, loading this whole fascial and elastic system of the body. And then the hand does nothing except for just come along for the ride like a whip. And because he's not slowing himself down at all, he's the first one we've seen this really clear indication of the follow through and his arm slot here coming around his body, which is more like what we see out of a baseball pitcher. So his looks the most like a baseball pitch in the air. And then we see his feet totally rotated around too. So pretty cool example from Matt Anderson. And it just never, ever looks like he's trying that hard. We talk often about injury-free velocity, but really one of the big things we end up working on with people who are already healthy and already hitting the ball hard is that the more we tap into the maximum efficiency on these biomechanics, the more consistency you get. The less hard you have to try to hit the ball at a certain velocity, because you're relying more on these really reproducible aspects of the body rather than just an abrupt shoulder effort. Okay, we got lots more video that we could watch, but I want to open it up there and get to any questions, either ones that have come in or some new ones. So Ryan, yeah, we're definitely going to get to the physical side in a moment. So good to tell your outside hitters to open up 90 degrees to the net and rotate in their swing, and tell middles to open up more like 45 degrees. That's probably more similar to what will happen. What we'll go through how we do all this technical training. Like I said, it's not quite as simple as telling them to do something and having them be able to do it really well. But this might be more similar to what we actually see. I'll show you one example in the middle, actually, in a second while we're looking at that, because we see middles who do a good job of getting this full 90 degrees, but that's really dependent on the athlete and the timing and the systems you're running and things like that. The problem with giving them kind of a set amount that we want them opening up to, and this is the same thing that we found with a lot of cueing, and the reason we've come down to these main three keys is that these three work really well together, and all of them build more on each other. Some of the other things that we've tried and we've seen done really commonly is this focus on the opposite arm and what we're doing there, or we haven't tried this, but it's a common one. It's this focused on the wrist snap. We ask a lot of athletes, how do you hit the ball hard? What do you need to do? And a lot of the young ones are like, I really got to snap my wrist. I'm like, okay, yeah. But anytime we give a cue that is within the highest velocity part of their movement, we find it slows them down. They change it from this whole motor learning pattern to a bunch of little sections. So we like to do a lot of stuff training them on just how do you actually produce the most amount of rotation with your body? How do you take all the tension out of your hand to get it super, super loose? And then they end up using this non-dominant arm to create more rotation. And it starts to happen naturally. But otherwise, we see them getting into reaching their non-dominant arm, but they haven't actually loaded up that elastic component of rotation. They've just reached, and then they try and do other stuff, and it doesn't have a great transfer. Has been a lot of our challenge with that. Occasionally we'll go to that because they're doing everything well, and that's the thing that's missing, but it's not where we start. So similarly, if we tell them this is the amount that we want you to open up, then it might not, for each athlete, load that degree of elasticity. For some people, that might be halfway to what they can do, and otherwise, other athletes, it might be kind of the max. What we use for middles versus outsides is this idea of an outfielder versus an infielder. So the outfielder is kind of like the swing we've been looking at, where there's this full 90-degree separation. It's this big low draw. It's the outfielder trying to get the ball from the fence to home plate. What's the absolute furthest you can throw it, the absolute hardest you could hit it? That works really well for outside hitters and for middles like Jackson in a hitting warm-up. But as soon as we start changing and trying to run something faster, and this applies to middles, but also if we're running a fast pipe or we're running a fast outside ball and we don't have time for that full long loop arm swing, we call it our infielder movement. And so this is more like a shortstop trying to get the ball to first base as soon as possible. So it's kind of like hot potato. So we train the athletes to still go through the same principles. Like, these are biomechanical principles that will not change. Rotation is still the way we need to do it. We still need to have looseness or it's not going to work, but we just get them to do it faster. So instead of this really long loop, it's this faster draw and then through from there. And I'm not doing an example here because I'm standing, but still the arm ends up coming high. And so we'll get them to feel this while they are throwing first. We do a lot of throwing work to build these mechanics, and then we'll get them to feel the difference of this longer big load arm swing and hitting from there, and then this short fast one. And then the degree that they end up opening there is kind of up to them, and up to what their bodies tell them. If an athlete can get 90 degrees of opening within the timing that they need for their approach, that they're going to be much better off there than opening up 45 degrees. So you want to give them as much as possible, because they're going to be able to hit much harder balls, and ultimately then have less load in their shoulder. So it's a good thought, the 90 degrees and 45 degrees, and it's often something you'll see a lot, but we would cue everyone pretty much into their maximum amount of opening, and then just being able to do it really fast in that infielder pattern. Numbers on external range of motion needed to get full whip. Yeah, really, really good question. So this external rotation of the shoulder, this guy here, is about 3 to 4 inches is kind of normal that we would see. So it's like a minus 20 degrees, something like that. We often get the athletes to just hold out a hand and say, can you get a hand width roughly in there? We'll see differences. Basically, the more of it that you get, your whip gets better and better and better, as long as we're strong in that position. So we'll do lots of strength work in those external rotation positions. As long as we get past 90 degrees, at least by like 5-10 degrees, they'll start to get some of this looseness, as long as it feels healthy. Health and being comfortable back there and not having it be painful is the biggest priority over range, and then range can start to come. But yeah, 20 degrees. Baseball will be the high end. They'd get to like 45 degrees, sometimes a little bit more. Volleyball players won't get there because we're not loaded. We don't have anything in our hand to bring us more into that position. But that 20 degrees is kind of like our really good place to be. Any arm swing follow through differences for float? Yeah, this is a really good question. And this is something we see athletes confused with so often, is that they are so used to float serving, especially young girls. This is like, sometimes games are just won and lost with serving, and then they're not that physical in attacking, and so they're super used to that float serve mechanic. And then when we get them to like hit balls back and forth, they toss it up like a float serve, and then they just hit it into the ground like this. I'm sure you've seen this in your players. So we start to tell our players that when we deal with float serving and we deal with this high speed attacking, they're totally different. They're like passing and setting. We want them to exist in totally different parts of the brain. So we usually get them to toss with one hand or with 2 hands when they're doing this attacking work, when they're doing like their arm warm up. And then when they actually get into their float serve, this does not really apply in terms of the technical cues for the most part at the beginning. The way you want to coach, the way you coach the float serve is great. Coach the float serve that way. They can have their arm up. They can have that more rigid hand, which of course we want. They can have the stopping the follow through to get float. They don't have to be doing as much with their arms if they're jumping and all these things. But at the high end of the float serve, we've had some cool feedback from athletes who start working on this for their attack, and they're like, wow, my float serve is so much better now because I've started relaxing my hand more, and I've started rotating from my torso more, and now there's this pop in my arm that comes at the end. So they're more rotational, they're looser, and then they just stop at the right moment. And so that's been really cool. There's a higher degrees of movement freedom in that, so it's harder for super young athletes to pick that up right away. That's like, rigidity always means it's like the earliest form of acquiring the skill, when everything kind of moves as one unit. This is like the typical parents trying to hit a volleyball the first time. Like everything is just rigid. When we try and do it, it all comes together, versus the really loose requires a lot of control from the brain. So yeah, You can change what they're doing there. But if you've got some athletes who have a really loose arm, then playing around with them, tossing their float serve with a little bit of a looser hand and having more of this snap pattern, more of this elastic pattern into their float serve gives a ton of instant velocity improvement, and can introduce some really, really cool float to the ball as well.
Yeah, Misha, I just shared TikTok. I'm just all the social media guy over here tonight. Anyways, it's UBC, one of the UBC women's servers. What's her name? Akash. Anyways, you can just see like kind of what you're talking about. Like she's very much on a jump float serve, very much like rotating and like going hard at that serve and a very whippy arm, even though it's not quite a spin serve. So I just shared that to give an example in the group.
Yeah, cool. Chris. Hey, Chris. I coached Chris back in the day. Do you work on rotation on their non-dominant side to decrease the amount of asymmetry? Fantastic question. Our philosophy with kind of the movement and the performance side of things is that we can be asymmetrical in skill. So they don't need to be able to hit as well with their left hand or their non-dominant hand, but we should be pretty symmetrical in movement patterns, which means we should have access to all those ranges of motion, and we should be pretty equally strong, not equally, but within maybe 20% on the other side so that we have less asymmetry. Chris is a kinesiologist as well, and maybe more now since I've talked to him last. And yeah, asymmetry is really tough on the body. So when we get into the exercises, which we're about to jump to now and kind of what that looks like, for sure, we want to train that both sides of the body. Volleyball is so common for having players who have big imbalances from side to side, really like any throwing sport, because we just do so much that's one-sided in the body. So that physical work that we do in the weight room, the physical work that we do as warm-up, as recovery, become really, really important on this longevity piece. We'll even do some of our throws, the ones that are less technical and more kind of getting the body to exaggerate rotation and exaggerate looseness. We'll do that with the opposite hand as well. Let them kind of have a laugh about it. But it's cool for the brain to figure out, like, how do I rotate really well that side and just be bouncy there? The throw's not going to be as accurate or anything, but it helps them learn on the other side.
On that point, it's a good kind of coaching tip, just like if you're wanting your athletes to, if they're having trouble with their footwork pattern, then getting them to do it like a left foot, like a left-handed approach pattern actually will help their brain connect to the right-handed approach pattern. So that's just sort of a good sort of little coaching tidbit in general there.
It's amazing that sometimes the athletes who really struggle with it on one side, you get them to do something on the other side, and you're like, oh, you're actually maybe better at it on this side. This is the one that isn't clogged and confused with all the other patterns. Okay, so the recipe for how we create changes. For us, this comes down to the physical ingredients, the technical piece, and then a mindset piece, which has been super fascinating for us over the years. So we'll talk about that at the end. So the first one on this physical side of things is what we call shoulder access. This is the ability for their shoulder to get into all of these positions. You could also call this the rotational power. Kind of brings in the rotational mobility as well, but there's access for the shoulder and for the spine. We need to be able to get into this 90 degrees of hip and shoulder separation. We need to be able to get into that shoulder external rotation. We need to be able to get into this arm overhead position and be comfortable up there. We need to be able to get into this position that we saw Hank in and Kira in, and shoulders be comfortable there. And what we find often is that those ranges are limited to start with or painful. So we make sure that we get those back. The next one, the shoulder ability side of things, is how strong and capable are we in those positions? So like I was saying, this external rotation is super important to be strong back there so that we can actually tolerate some speed coming back into it so that we can bounce back out of it. And so it's not just about stretching things and rolling things to open up that range, but we do a lot of work to load up the body at these end ranges of the shoulder range of motion. That includes overhead, external rotation, lots of different patterns, but primarily those two. So you get a lot done if we work kind of mostly on those patterns. We do a lot of hanging work for the shoulder, as it's proven to be one of the most kind of reliable rotator cuff bulletproofing exercises. Training athletes to hang well from two hands and then to hang well from one hand. There's a cool relationship between grip strength and what happens in your rotator cuff. And basically, as you squeeze your grip, we activate all of those rotator cuff muscles synergistically. They hold the whole shoulder in its joint. And that's really what we want the rotator cuff to do when we're contacting a ball overhead, is we want it to lock in the shoulder so that you can hit all the way through the ball and it's not doesn't bounce back off the ball, or it doesn't feel a lot of weight as it hits through it. The rotator cuff, we say, is the worst named group of muscles that there is, because if you look at them in their individual components, they all produce rotation in different ways, but when we look at their functional role, they work together synergistically to lock the shoulder in there. So that's why we see athletes doing band work with their shoulder just forever. They're training the rotator cuff to create rotation, when really it's more of like a shoulder stabilizer in those positions. And so we train the shoulder a little bit differently there with the shoulder ability stuff. And then the rotational power, I'd say, of these is the one that is best done in the strength and conditioning world. They understand this well. They do a lot of cable chops and med ball chops and med ball throws and things like that are really good for developing rotational power. One thing that we see missing there a lot of the time is kind of like the strength that underlies power. So we'll always do assessments with athletes on how much rotation do you have in your spine? Can you get into this 90-degree hip shoulder separation? And if you can, fantastic. Then let's load you up there. And do you have strength going through that entire range and then coming back? And that's super key that we have that, because without that, then we can't really develop power there if we don't have any strength there first. We'll just be compensating. So that's one of the things we try and get all the young athletes doing right off the bat. I'll share some stuff right at the end where you can see a few examples of what these exercises are. Moving on to the technical side of things. So we know the 3 keys that we're working towards. The process that we found for this, like we said, it's not just telling them what to do. We've got to decrease the complexity to the point that they can find success with the new thing that they're trying to do. And this is really hard for some athletes, especially if they're already at a high level, and if they're not great at change, or if they're not great at being bad at things or stepping outside their comfort zone. Like the less coachable athlete has trouble with this for sure. Because in decreasing the complexity, we're trying to find the place where they can do the thing well that you're asking them to do. One of the key principles that we use here is that we only try and change one of those 3 keys at once. We find a lot of coaches really frustrated with their athletes not making changes when they've been trying to give them all the cues at once. And every time they do an attack, they're giving them a different thing. They're like, you got to rotate more and keep the arm high, and you have to land with feet rotated, and your arm's not loose enough. And they're like, oh, they're just not making changes. And it just totally goes against everything we know about motor learning and how hard it is to change something that's part of such an ingrained, complex pattern already. So we try and choose the thing that is the highest priority or the lowest hanging fruit with them. We often start with rotation because it has this immediate bulletproofing impact on the back and on the shoulder. If we can get them rotating more, they'll tax both of those areas less. And it's the fastest way. Looseness is arguably the faster way. It's a fast way to get instant changes in your velocity. So if we're trying to work on rotation, we'd go through these levels of complexity. And in our coaching academy app, we have this broken down in detail on the exact kind of drills we would run with this. But basically, the most complexity is like full match play. You're not making any changes there. Please don't ask your players to change something when they're in like a high pressure state. That's the time to go play. But underneath that, we see all of the like match play situations in practice. Less complex than that. We see more drill setups. But as we decrease complexity more, usually we find that the place they need to make changes is not in jumping and attacking, but lower level than that. And we would see maybe like attacking on the ground. Can you hit a down ball with this pattern? Often the answer is no as they start this. Often their down ball pattern is to just draw back in that exact same position that they're doing when they're jumping. And so, okay, we haven't decreased the complexity enough. They try and change it there, but they can't really. So then if they can't do it standing and attacking, we go a level of complexity lower, which is to throwing. And we work on a lot of patterns with athletes in throwing, usually throwing a ball. We really like wiffle balls because they can throw them hard and they're not going to take their partner's head off like they would with a tennis ball. And it allows them to keep their hand nice and relaxed and loose in that position we wanted to have it in. Throwing a volleyball becomes problematic because they have to hold it up high and palm it like that. And they're going to end up with their hand high and no capacity for developing looseness. Sure, they can develop some rotation there, but they're not going to have that looseness feel if you ever need to work on that. So we would then go to some of those throwing variations and in our Coach's Armswing Academy app, we give all the options that we use for training rotation with throws, for training looseness, for training the low draw, and how those come together. But we would find a couple of those for them to work on until we're like, all right, this looks really good with your throw. See, now your body can do it, your arm can do it. This is the exact pattern that we want. We might show them video on like, look, this looks fantastic. And so make sure they can do it throwing, because some athletes, they can't. And this is where the level of complexity comes. If they can't do it throwing still, then there might be something physical, this lower level of foundation. Maybe their body can't get into that position, or it's painful when they get into that position. So we find somewhere that they can have their aha moment. They go, yeah, this feels really good. And then we gradually increase the complexity. Two really big jumps that we see when we're doing this. The first one is from throwing to hitting a volleyball, obviously harder. So we've got a couple things that we work on to try and bridge that gap. So they get this idea more of throwing their hand at the volleyball and trying to reproduce this exact thing that they did with a wiffle ball with a volleyball. So a simple version of it would be like throw one and then hit one, and then throw one and then hit one. But we do drills where they miss the volleyball and then they hit the volleyball, and they look at video on both. And we're just trying to lay the foundation, lay the groundwork for this new motor learning in the brain, this new pattern that they can choose and can get consolidated so that they can then choose it when there's a volleyball in front of them. And this is like a fresh bud of a plant when it starts. It's so fragile, and they need like no other feedback, and they need just a little bit of time to kind of get the feel of that. And then after 10, 15, 20 reps, they're like, all right, I've got it. I have enough reps in that pattern. They're like, yeah, that feels kind of comfortable. Video is really great here if you have the opportunity to help them see what they're doing. And then we increase a little bit more. So we would do lots of variations in standing. We always really like to get them into pepper variations. We don't like just regular pepper, but we like kind of long distance pepper where they get to hit 9 meters and they have their own setter, and we introduce a lot of variations there. But we like them being able to apply this arm swing in a continuous way before we think that they'll apply it in a continuous way while jumping. Just because it's a much higher complexity thing once we add the jumping into it. And if we haven't laid the foundation, if they can't do it on the ground, then often what we find is it's really difficult to do in the air. Not impossible. Some athletes are incredible and they just get it figured out, but a lot of them struggle with that. So that's kind of our process on the technical ingredients, and how we make some of those changes. Then we just gradually add more. We would do self-toss work. We really like getting athletes spin serving, or some even like half court spin serve variations. We had a bunch of U12 girls spin serving last weekend in Alberta, working with a club, and it's so cool to see what they can do. And they have no idea that it's so amazing and so good. They're like, I don't know, I'm just doing the movement that I did when I was trying to throw a wiffle ball high up the wall. Just feels like that. Doesn't feel like volleyball. But the coaches are looking at them and going like, wow, this is a crazy high end. The controls all over the place, but the stuff they're starting to do with their body is amazing, even at 12. So we always try and get athletes with some sort of spin serve practice so that they can get reps on this, because it takes a lot of reps. And then through the drills that they're doing, ones with a little bit of an accuracy focus, and then with blockers and offsets in different ways, and then more pass to attack and running different things. You guys are coaches, you know how to increase complexity in those. But if we jump too many, if you jump 5 things at once, and even when you jump one thing, when we do one level of complexity higher, expect that things are going to revert back a little bit. And that's fine. We've just gone like one level up, and now this new pattern hasn't existed there before. So they need a little bit of time to go up and be like, all right, what do I choose? Which one do I do here? They'll do a couple wrong. They'll maybe be aware of it. You'll help them with it. And then eventually they'll fall into the right one. And then they consolidate that, and then you move them up again. This is the advantage that we have. We have what we like to say is the easiest job in the volleyball world, because we get to come in and focus on one skill, a very small part of the whole game of volleyball, and get to be totally focused there. So we can make changes pretty quickly. And once you know those secrets, you can really make those as well. But it does take time, and it takes attention to it. And if you've got 12 or 18 other players you're trying to pay attention to, sometimes that can be challenging. I'm going to take a look at some questions before we hop into the last one. Better to show video and go with whole learning with the youngest athletes, or better to chunk? Yeah, really good question. I don't know. We've done a little bit of both. Sometimes for the young athletes, we'll focus a ton on the whole learning with throwing. Sometimes it takes them quite a while to get their throwing pattern really solid. And then when they get that, the working. Okay, Jeffrey, I'll get to that in a second. So the kind of working on the throwing side of things often takes a little bit longer time at that age. So we'll get them doing like a lot more variations there, like a lot more time with footballs and dodgeballs and frisbees and things like that, just to really develop that pattern. More so than we'll show them a lot of video and get them to break down and say like, oh, do you see here? Like there's not as much hip and shoulder rotation, because most 13-year-olds will probably be like, what? There are some athlete by athlete. There are some who come train with us one-on-one and they're into it. They get it and they're ready to work on it. But I think it's kind of like athlete by athlete level. I would lean towards what can we develop with this approach to the whole pattern, and then kind of problem solve. We usually use the video on problem solving side of things. We'll talk about this in the mindset side of things. We really like to ask, what are you working on? And how's it going? And then if they're off base, they're like, all right, I'm working on rotation at a time. I'm like, cool. And how's that going? And they're like, yeah, pretty good, I think. I'm like, okay, show me one more. And they don't rotate at all. Like, all right, let's have a look at some video. And then they can see it. But they need to have that first thing where they know what they're working on. And we'll talk about more of that in the mindset side of things. For clarification, are we talking about external rotation of the shoulder or T-spine rotation? Oh, good question. When we talk about working on rotation first, that one we're talking about thoracic spine rotation, that spinal rotation piece. The external rotation of the shoulder, yes, also rotation. We would call that more kind of the looseness is where that shows up. But that has its kind of root in like developing the physical ingredients. Yeah, really good question, Jeffrey. All right, the last one's here. This is probably the biggest differentiating factor we've seen among athletes. The ones who make changes really quickly, we work with their club once, and then we come back 6 months later and see them in another camp. And we're like, wow, that is remarkable. You've changed everything and your shoulder pain went away right away. Versus the ones who we see a year later and things are exactly the same. So the first one is awareness. And this is why we said our favorite question is, what are you working on? How's it going? Basically, what's happening here? Are you trying to observe what's happening, or are you just going through the reps? We see this a bunch. I'm sure you'll see this in your athletes as you try and introduce something with kind of a focus on it, and they just do things the exact same way. They try and get as many reps of like just the thing that they're doing without any deliberate focus on how they're trying to do it. And for us, knowing that they're doing that or knowing what they're doing is the first thing. So whenever we're running one of these camps, we'll walk around and be asking each athlete, what are you working on? How's it going? How was that one? When we do a lot of drills, kind of working on this, incorporating more rotation in the throw first, for example, we'll make that really clear. Like, we want everyone finishing with your shoulders facing the opposite wall, or we want you to replace one shoulder with the other. And then when an athlete just does this and they do nothing, like, how was the rotation on that one? And like, I don't know. Like, all right, so that's the one thing we're trying to figure out here. Want to like pay attention to the next one. Let me know what you notice. So that's the first thing that for us is like a non-negotiable. They need to develop this awareness. Then we really like them to get used to setting an intention on what they're trying to do. And this is so key to the habit change side of things. The intention, we like them to focus on just one thing to start with. So even if they're aware that, yeah, their arm needs to draw back lower and their hand needs to be looser and they need to get more hip shoulder separation and their approach needs to have blah, 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 we get them to choose one thing. Like, what's the one that might have the best impact on some of the other ones? Sometimes they have an idea, sometimes it's some trial and error, but we know that when they focus on too many things, we just see no change happen. Often we've asked some athletes at camps after like introducing everything and how they're working on a couple things, and coaches call us over and they're like, can you check her out? She's like really, really struggling with this and kind of frustrated. I'm like, all right, what are you working on? I'm like, well, I'm trying to have more rotation while my hand is low, and I'm trying to get more topspin on the ball and also hit the 5. I just can't do it. And okay, yeah, that sounds hard. So why don't we choose one thing? And then usually they're like, all right, I will rotate more with a loose hand and a better approach. Okay, still one thing, let's dial it back. And eventually when they get to focusing on that one thing, then we can be really clear on, are you making progress? And did you make this change? Because often what happens is we start making progress in the process. They'll learn how to rotate. They learn how to relax the hand, but the outcome right away isn't better. And so the athletes who are really stuck on that outcome and hanging their head anytime the ball isn't hit into the court, or hanging their head anytime it's not a perfect contact on their hand and being hard on themselves, are the ones who never change. So we try and get them dialed in on this intention side of things. My intention is I want my shoulders facing the opposite wall when I finish this hit, or when I finish this throw even, or I want my approach to, I want to land rotated in my approach like Matt Anderson. And then when we check in on what you're focusing on, how's it going? If they're like, yeah, I did it, but I hit the ball into the net, that's for us like our biggest responsibility of the entire session is to bring them up out of that dark place and say, that is amazing that you did that. You just changed something that you haven't been able to change. Who cares what the outcome of this was right now? If you keep working on that process thing, like you've proven to yourself that you can change, the outcome will come. And we like to tell the athletes and coaches that their brains will do cool brain things when they're doing the fundamentals well. Their brain will figure out timing. Their brain will figure out contact points. It will adjust all of those things. What we see so commonly when athletes actually start developing velocity in their hand on their swing is that they start undercutting the ball. They start fooming it underneath because they are getting there faster before the balls drop down. And they're so hard on themselves about it. And how's it going, everybody? And they're like, haven't hit a good ball yet. I'm like, okay, what's happening? Keep going under it. And then we look at their pattern, and it's so good. And then like 5-10 reps later, we hear like the explosion in the side of the gym. And like, whoa, what was that? And as the brain figures out the thing, if you trust that process, and if you're this third key, super patient with themselves, really, and then us with them as coaches, then amazing things start to happen. So this idea at the bottom that we really think that their mindset determines whether this change occurs or not. And so once they have the thing that they're working on, a lot of what we try and do and try and encourage coaches to do is just create this container for this constant experiment and this constant change, and keep encouraging them when they're making changes in the process. One of the things we talk about often, and it's a whole video on this and all of our mental strategies in the Armswing Academy as well, is this checkmark effect, that you're going to start at a certain level of something, and before you get better, there's going to be this process of getting worse. You're going to make a lot of errors. So I always like to ask athletes, like, who's hit like ridiculous balls today, or who's gotten a lot worse? And everyone's like, hands up, hands up. Like, this is perfect. We've seen like every national team player that we work with goes through this as well. They're terrible. They're hitting balls off their elbow. They're hitting balls like completely sideways underneath the net. And if they master these things, particularly the patience side of things, the changes happen so fast. But the people who just get frustrated don't really make it anywhere with this. So I'll just talk about a couple of these next steps and possibilities, and then that might take us to 9, but I'll stick around for a few minutes with questions if you have any. I've put these in low commitment to higher commitment. Easiest one would be check out Athlete Wellness Academy on Instagram. If you're interested in seeing more of this, we've been a little quiet lately because we were switching social media people, but we will have a lot more stuff from the 10 U Sport programs we work with across Canada. We were just down in the States doing some cool stuff with No Easy Buckets and some of the top US male athletes in college and high school. So we've got some cool clips from that coming out. So we've got a lot that will go up on Instagram if you want to see more examples of this. If you check out athletewellnessacademy.com, at the very bottom of all the pages in the footer is our newsletter sign up. So if you want to know if there are camps coming to your city, then and new programs come out and new additions to the Armswing Academy for athletes and for coaches, definitely hop on our newsletter list there. We'll try and send something out monthly. This third one, bringing AWA to your team or club. If this is of interest to you and you want us to come in and run one of these camps for your team or your whole club or a handful of teams or a handful of athletes, I'll put a link in the chat right now that has just a little questionnaire. We can put your name and contact info and where you're from. And then in the next day or two, I will follow up with all of you guys who fill that out, and we can chat details that way. So there's that link. And then the very last one, the final way to take the next step is what I've been referencing all day. And we put this together because we've done so many of these webinars and coaches clinics and presentations, and we realized that even in an hour and a half of me talking as fast as possible, we can barely do it justice and get into a lot of the specifics on these things. So if you want to see all the physical progressions, all of the actually, maybe I'll show you guys if I can here. All the physical progressions, all the technical progressions that we were talking about. We've got different warm-up variations in there. We've got recovery routines, and we've got a whole problem-solving section, which has been fun putting together. It's kind of like as you introduce everything and take people through the majority of the normal patterns. Some people will respond well to it and some people won't. And so what do you do when some aren't responding as well? And then that whole section takes you through what we end up doing with athletes. And we're going to be continuing to post more and more examples as we run those sessions with athletes. So I'm just trying to show you guys a little bit of an inside peek on what this academy looks like for coaches. So this is it. There's a deeper dive on the whole recipe side of things. So within each one of these, we go deeper into like the shoulder.
Hey everyone, it's Nick from the AWA Academy.
And that's kind of like the overview. And then on the physical side of things, we have in-depth ways for doing all of this assessment that we work on, assessing the shoulder, assessing the spine, and then making improvements on any of those. And then a few things that we do for kind of bulletproofing the shoulder, creating more rotational strength, and then a few concepts that we found super useful. And then the technical side of things has all of our attacking and throwing options. And then we're adding some more continuous variations as we go, some more drill options. This is not going to be like a full comprehensive drill bank. Our philosophy on the drills is get them doing the stuff well and then encourage them to still do stuff well in the drills. Like whatever reps they're doing, if they're putting in balls to start a butterfly drill, or they're playing pepper, or they're putting in balls off a box or something like that, encourage them to be mindful about their technique and their intention on that. And then we see the fastest things happen. You don't need to do specific arm swing drills, has been our perspective. And then we've got these movement skills kind of workouts and this recovery library in there. So if that stuff is of interest to you, then there is a discount through our partnership with Volleyball BC. So Rai, correct me if I getting this wording wrong, but if you were a registered club coach with Volleyball BC.
Yep, that's right.
Cool. Then you get a 50% discount on the annual membership to that. So usually it's $149 US, but you guys will get it for $75 US for the year. So you get access to everything that's in there. What I didn't show you is there's also a community chat in there, like a forum. So if you have questions or you want to share videos, then we can't like go back and forth with everybody's video with the amount of people that are in there, but once every couple of weeks we take a handful of videos that come to us and do videos of them for everyone and share that. So lots of opportunity to keep learning more if you are keen on this stuff. And if that is the case and you want to do that one, then I'll put that link up here. This is just for the Volleyball BC coaches that we set this up. But maybe we'll try and do another webinar for some of the athletes who are on here on, oops, I just sent that to Kylie by accident. We'll try and do another webinar for athletes and talk about the Armswing Academy for athletes, because it's quite a bit different.
Cool. Did you want to open it up for questions again, Mischa?
Yeah, absolutely. You can either come off your mic or come off mute and disturb the sound of me having talked for a very long time. And I'll ask I'll answer one question that came in the chat here. If you've got to run right now, because it's 9, thank you so much for being here, for the questions that you guys posed. I hope it was at least a little bit interesting. Hope that you learned something. And please reach out if you are interested in learning any more about this. And hopefully we'll see you at a Volleyball BC Coaches Symposium sometime.
Potentially, yep. Stay
Yeah.
tuned.
One question here. When is a good time to work on the strength or physical aspect? Is 12U too early to be concerned about it? If so, is there anything to prioritize, muscle group strength versus fundamental movements? Yeah, really good question here, Kylie. The physical development side of things, we would say like 12 is kind of a great time. This is when we see players start to lose maybe some of their fundamental patterns that they might have. For sure, we want to just work on movement patterns here. We're not really interested in them being strong or developing like a lot of power or speed stuff at that point. Especially because volleyball is such a late maturation sport. The biggest thing that we can do for them is get them moving really well and get their mechanics really dialed in. One thing you can start to work on a little bit that would be in like the power speed category is just their jumping mechanics. Because they're going to be jumping so much. Volleyball becomes a really explosive sport really early, usually way before their bodies are prepared for it. So if we start getting them able to squat just body weight really well, able to do lots of stuff on the ground, basically think like yoga patterns. We want them to be able to get into all those positions and be strong in them. Then they usually do really well with working on like some fun jumping variations. Doesn't need to look like a university or a national team jump training practice. Obviously shouldn't, but like fun kind of jumps that they're doing, trying to jump from a line to a line, trying to jump in circles and land well. We'll just train that resiliency. Usually they're pretty kind of bulletproof at that age, but as they start getting a little bit older and the load gets a bit more, if they've got that resiliency piece from having done a lot of basic jumps and being comfortable in those patterns and knowing how to control their body, that will go a long way. So definitely 12U, the stuff that's in the Armswing Academy for coaches, those movement skills workouts are kind of exactly what we would do with 12 years old. All body weight stuff, but just moving in kind of fun, weird ways. Any other questions? We're getting all the rotational power and looseness. Do we want to be leading this overall motion with the hip? Yeah, absolutely. We could, maybe I'll show you a video again for a second. We don't cue that a ton because it kind of happens naturally. If we were on the ground, we could cue it a little bit more, and we do cue it in throwing sometimes more. But because, where this went, because they're in the air, the sensation is a little bit different. I can't find how to share this video right now. It's like disappeared off my screen. But if we look at someone like Matt Anderson's, basically what we see is that as it's loosened up, for sure, the first thing that starts to rotate is the hip. And that puts more stretch on this already stretched out system and kind of takes it to this point of recoil. And then we see the recoil come from the hips and then the rib cage and then the shoulder. And all this time, the hand is basically still going backwards and in still full stretch, and then it will come forward. So definitely when they're on the ground and you're working on throwing and they have a lot of control through the feet, we do a ton of this kind of hip focus side of things. We found that if they're in the air and we start talking a lot about the hip, they kind of start doing some interesting, weird things. It almost like gets in their way. The one we'll focus on a lot that kind of indirectly cues the hip is getting their feet around, like we saw Matt Anderson landing from his approach and Brody Hofer landing from his attack. If they land rotated like that, again, something they don't really have to think about in the air in that split second, but something that they can measure afterwards. Did I do this or did I not do this? That will ensure that the hips are getting around and the hips are going through that pattern. That, as long as their approach has that almost 90-degree block step and a big turn there.
Another question about the feet there. Just as you for that, just because I worked with Mischa for a long time and work with a lot of athletes privately. I think for me, like the hip to hand thing is a cue that I would use on the ground, like Mischa is saying, and then it's trying to find the feeling like in the air. So that's what I sort of use is like, can we find that feeling? Because yeah, I don't cue the hip because like Mischa said, I just sort of guess I'm thinking a bit too returning, but the feeling. And if they're struggling often, like say we're going to jump spin serve or we're going to attacking, just trying to working on it and they're struggling, then I'll make them hit a couple down balls like in between reps just to get that feeling again of that. And that seems to work pretty well.
Jeffrey, what aspect of cueing the feet do you mean? Because this could go a couple different ways. Potentially two very good points or questions in here.
I'm just gonna unmute for this. My interpretation of cueing the feet was when you said like Matt Anderson, when you kind of rotate in the air and then have your right foot land in front as a right-handed hitter.
Yeah,
that's what my interpretation of that was. So is that something that we're kind of cueing?
For sure. Yeah, really good question. We cue it a ton as a way to learn this rotational pattern in the arm swing. We get them to really over exaggerate it in throws that they're doing and in their kind of like warm up attacks. And then as that starts getting into more gameplay stuff, and maybe they're not hitting a ball that is coming cross court, they're more going like off body, those feet will start doing different things. But for the most part, we want everyone to show that they can do that really consistently. This is what we would want like their most controlled reps to look like. And then once it gets into tactical gameplay, there's going to be a ton of variation and we don't worry about that too much. But the more used to this they get, also the better it is, especially on the women's side, that they get used to this 2-foot landing, even if it's not turning all the way around, but even if it just turns them back towards the net. If we can limit the amount of 1-foot landings that don't need to be there, we bring a little bit more or less injury risk to the knee as they get fatigued and are in weird positions. They're always going to land on 1 foot with different plays and different offenses and different timing and stuff like that. But for the most part, everyone, like when we do this with a university team and everyone starts to get it, everyone at the end will look the same way with those feet coming around in the warm up, like maybe hitting a spin serve, and then afterwards it'll get different.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Really good question.
As you start doing some of this stuff, like you will find like the approach can sometimes be the limiting factor to the arm swing. So like just like I think the earlier you can kind of do this, especially with teaching a jump spin where they're tying it into like a 4-step approach, I think the better. Because I work with, as for an example, I work with a 16U provincial team athlete, and yeah, he could get the rotation, he could do all the things that I've learned from Mischa, jump serve, warm up, but then as soon as we started attacking, he was kind of back to his old habits of like not fully rotating. And the reason why was because his approach was late. Like he was always starting and rushing his first couple steps. So then he didn't have time to get fully open, fully loaded. So he could then rotate his hip. So he's always like kind of like jammed a little bit. So like we just basically, it's like, okay, it's not that you can't do it. It's just that your approach, we need to get your first couple steps more consistent. So anyways, as you're kind of going, especially if you're working with some older athletes like 16, 17, 18U, you know, it might be something to do with their approach or their footwork that's kind of preventing them from actually really opening up this powers. And I don't know, Mischa, that's my question for you is, do you guys talk about like the approach and that kind of like, you know, that like those steps and the patterns for that to connect to the arm swing in your academy?
Yeah, Nick and I often say it's our 4th key. But it kind of relies on knowing what they're doing with the arms, and then we spend a ton of time on the approach, because like exactly like you're saying there, you can be phenomenal at it on the ground, you can be phenomenal at it when you're in control of everything, but if that's the thing that breaks down and your feet end up more straight, or you're really late, or any variety of things that happens there, then we lose any potential to apply that in the air. So yeah, we focus a ton on that.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah, I was gonna Okay, sorry, you go first. You go first.
I was just gonna ask a quick question. When you're doing the throwing pieces on the ground, are you mindful of that block foot in those in that portion, or you just do that when you add in the actual approach? Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, totally. Really good question. We'll get them mostly opened up like towards their hitting shoulder. So we often say to them like a baseball pitcher, not facing at your partner. So we're not really precise on what that front foot is doing and like the angle of it and whether they're on toe or heel or anything like that. But we want their whole body turned towards the side to start with when they're doing those throwing patterns. Otherwise, we find is if they're kind of facing straight ahead, which arguably is a little bit more applicable, and because we end up as this final position for the arm swing of the hips forward and the shoulders open this way and then uncoiling from that. But it's a harder way to learn the throwing. So that's like another tangent that we have as a variation, lumbar lock throws that that we do a bit later on. But for the most part, learning the throwing pattern, we want them just doing it like a baseball pitcher, learning how to use the whole body. We get them over rotating, like opening right towards the back wall. But then we let their feet totally rotate in that. We want it to be pretty, we want their feet to be pretty loose and flexible on the ground so that as they finish that throw, it can allow them to totally turn and face towards the other wall. And that can't happen if their feet are planted. So we'll often even like get them to throw and then spin in a circle after that or step forward after that so that they get this feel of letting the whole body move through that pattern rather than just throwing and slowing down with their feet planted.
And that's like a good actually indicator if they are doing it kind of like you're saying with the jump spin serve, if their feet are rotated when they land. It's like, is their back foot kind of coming forward when they're throwing or even when they're down ball? Because that shows, that's from my experience, it shows a lot of rotation and looseness versus like stiffness, like a float serve, like you're talking about, where they're trying to like control that, slow that swing down a little bit or stay a bit more square versus like, because often like the athlete will just like keep that foot like rooted almost the back foot, and then it's preventing that rotation or that feeling of looseness. So I'll say, hey, I want you to actually have that foot like come around in front, and like that's an indicator. And so they start, oh yeah, and then they start being a bit more looser.
Totally.
My experience.
Yeah, great question, Patrice. Jeffrey, did you have another one?
I'm having trouble formulating the question, but as an athlete myself and starting to coach, I found that I've had a bit of trouble from being on the floor and bridging the gap to being into the air. And then Brian was kind of talking about how he kind of asked a question about how this could be related to an approach. So I just wanted some more information about how we can bridge this gap, if that kind of makes sense.
Definitely. I should have talked about this. I kind of missed it when we were talking about the hardest transitions are throwing to volleyball, and then the next one from standing to jumping. There's a lot that happens in there, so it's really easy to jump over that. One of the transition pieces we like there is approach throws. So we'll start working on that full pattern just with a wiffle ball in the hand. And I like the cue that Ryan was talking about before, like let's get the pattern in throwing and then just feel it attacking. So we don't have to focus on it as much. You get to do all the more fine tuning stuff. But that's where we can even start looking at video and being like, let's get this wiffle ball in your hand, get you through this full 4-step approach, and then throw and land rotated over the net and see, can your body do this? Look at some video on it, see what's going well, what's not, make any tweaks that we need to. And then we're like, all right, that looks really good. And there's something that clicks for the athlete too. They're like, yeah, this feels good. Feels like it's efficient. I'm trying less hard. It's like a bit more smooth and fluid. Then awesome. Now let's throw a volleyball in the air and try and do the same thing. And this is the, like, you've done all the hard work at this point, turn the brain off a little bit, care not at all where this ball goes, because probably 9 times out of 10, the first one you hit is going to be terrible if your process is really good, because it's going to be completely different timing for everything. Like you might not hit the ball, and that's okay. But if you're able to really try and go and get that feeling and have the feeling of throwing a wiffle ball while you're jumping in that approach, again, your brain will do cool brain things and figure out the timing of how to put that all together. And then after 5, 10, 15 reps, they'll get a few cool contacts on the ball. Video is really useful to look at trying to make that transition, especially if you're an athlete, like an experienced athlete who's already starting to coach like yourself there. You'd be able to pick out some things there. And we're always looking for, what do I revert back to? Because that gives you your indication of, okay, that's what I work on. The first thing I noticed there was like, wow, my hand just goes high immediately. Like, okay, I'm going to do a couple throws then with my hand super low, get that ingrained in my brain. And then that's the feel that I want to bring into my next spin serve that I'm going to do, or my next attack off of a set. You're going to have my hand super low. And we like to encourage athletes to just over exaggerate things. If you're trying to break a high draw pattern with the hand, then how low can we get? Can we be Jackson Howe and have that hand dusting the hip as it comes through? You might try and do that, but end up with your arm just in the happy medium spot is often what we see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Yeah, Mischa, I didn't tell you this, but just recently I was working with an athlete, a bunch of boys, and new to volleyball, grade 9, and athletic, and we're getting all the stuff on the ground, but one guy in particular was struggling within the air, and he was so good on the ground. And so finally I just said, okay, that feeling on the ground, like throwing a baseball. I'm like, that's the feeling we want. And I just started actually saying to him, baseball, like that was the cue we used, like when he was attacking, baseball. And I no kid you, he went from like basically like pushing the ball over the net to just like fully like unleashing on these balls, because he was obviously an athlete that had that feeling pretty ingrained, whether he played baseball or not, but just got that. And so without me really saying anything besides baseball to him, he was like, all right, starts smashing on balls. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, amazing. That's such a good example of like, this is an ingrained pattern within the body. This is the reason why so much of it, baseball looks the same and all these throwing sports look the same. Like, it is where the body gravitates to when it gets to have its way. We worked with a team once, and there was this cool girl on the team. She was actually the setter, but she went from having like just the most rigid body and like hitting balls like this and having some back pain. And at one point in the session, she just started unloading on balls and just like crushing pipe balls that we were hitting all together, like the hardest attacks on the team. And at the end, she's like, I've played softball my whole life, and everyone always told me it would be good for volleyball. And I never had any idea what they were talking about until today. And then it made sense. It's just the same. So it's super cool to see that come together.
Yeah, totally.
All right, 9:20. I think that's probably a good place to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks obviously for Mischa, for all your time and energy and effort. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me or to Mischa if you have any more questions. And yeah, good to see everybody, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and enjoy time with friends and family. Mischa, anything you want to say to end?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan, and Volleyball BC for putting this on, and thanks to everyone for coming out. Wishing you guys a happy holidays as well, and please reach out if there's anything that we can help with, or you want to keep nerding out about the Armswing like I always do.
Cool. All right, thanks everybody.